Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Julia Zimmerman, and I serve as the Program Officer for Education, Leadership, and Engagement here at Community Progress. Community Progress webinars equip participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's webinar, we are joined by Liz Kozub, Associate Director of Technical Assistance at the Center for Community Progress, and Tarek Abdelazim, Vice President of Technical Assistance at the Center for Community Progress. Before turning it over to our speakers, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them via the Q&A box below. We will share slides and a video recording of today's presentation in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to events@communityprogress.org. And with that, I will turn it over to Liz.
There we go. Thank you so much for that introduction, Julia. Give me just a moment to pull up my slides. There we go. Just make sure Tart can access them too. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. It is the first of our webinars in 2026, so I know Tarek and I are excited to kick off this series for the year. And I'm especially excited to be co-leading this conversation with Tarek because I think in many ways it's emblematic of my journey and career in solving vacant property challenges, and hopefully it provides a little bit of a sense of nostalgia for folks that are joining our conversation today. And this really gave us an opportunity to reflect on how far the field has come over the years, the impacts that you all have made on the ground in solving the challenges of vacant properties, but also taking some time to acknowledge that there's real challenges that lie ahead that we face every day that can sometimes feel like an uphill battle, especially with, the rhetoric and the policy changes that are coming our way. But there's so many creative and enthusiastic experts that are deeply passionate about justice issues around addressing vacancy, creating stable communities for all. And we're excited to just be with you and uplift some of the incredible work that's happening on the ground. So in an effort to spread a little joy today, we're hoping that folks could share a little bit about themselves and their work in the vacant property space. So whether you've been at this work for decades, you've been in the trenches, you're an OG in solving vacant property challenges, or you're an emerging leader or just dipping your toe into Community Progress's network and kind of what that's all about, we welcome you all. So please share your name, where you're coming from, and the amount of years that you've been out this so that we could celebrate with you all. So for me, I started this work back in 2012 as a grad student. I was researching the Pennsylvania land bank enabling legislation. And that's kind of how I started getting connected with these quirky folks from Community Progress that were leading that effort. So it's been about 13 years and a very, very exciting, and a lot's changed over that time. So let's share a bit about what that is. You could find our bios in the resources tab if you want to learn more about Tarek and I. So as I mentioned, this is the kickoff of our webinar series for the year, and it's really meant to lay the foundation of like vacancy challenges general, the field, what we're seeing, and some of the systems and tools that could be helpful in solving vacancy challenges. So our subsequent webinars will provide a lot of detail around how exactly that can be implemented and some really cool stories and practitioner-led interventions that have proven to be really impactful. But for today's conversation, we're going to cover like, what do we mean by systemic vacancy? Where does it exist? Why does it exist? And what we should be looking out for. We'll share some observations from the field, what we've seen at Community Progress, and what we've learned from you all that are really doing this work on the ground. And then we'll talk about some specific rules and challenges that have come up in the past 5 years or so, how we think communities could be responding to those challenges, and again, uplifting some of the creative ways folks have done so. All right, so let's jump in. So when we talk about vacancy across the country, it can look different in different places. If we're talking about residential, vacant properties is kind of dependent on the housing stock that we're trying to address. whether that be single family homes that have heirs property issues that have been vacant for decades, whether that is multi-unit apartment complexes that have experienced significant fire damage, the property owner has walked away. It's kind of dependent on what that housing stock looks like. It also could look different in urban communities and suburban communities and rural communities, but still having the same challenging impacts across different types of community sizes and density. In many places that we work in, vacant commercial structures are a real challenge, whether that be scattered sites throughout a neighborhood, whether it be a main street district, or whether that be vacant properties in a downtown that used to be the lifeblood of the city, all coming with their complexities with them. Nearly in every community that we work in, vacant lots present a challenge. It could be a result of demolition that has happened, existing debris on the lot. It could be a place for dumping. These are really unsightly, very unsafe, and very harmful to the communities. And some communities are dealing with all three, where the market is just broken and there's just challenges with various types of vacant properties in a concentrated place. So, regardless of the vacant property challenges that are showing up, they have the same impact and harm in community, often leading to a drain on municipal resources because they're not collecting the tax dollars that are needed to support communities. And they're also draining resources to respond to these challenges through code enforcement, through maintenance. Also has significant impacts on the health of residents, on their fiscal stability and their ability to generate wealth for years to come and for their families in the future. So we know that addressing vacancy is a real goal. And part of that is really understanding what are the underlying causes and factors that are leading to entrenched vacancy in a community. And many of those factors are kind of consistent across communities, regardless of where we're working. So we have on your screen here the cycle of vacancy that exists, and we're going to touch on just a few of the major challenges. Again, just to paint a picture of like what are the challenges that we are trying to solve so that we could most appropriately connect the right tools. One of the primary causes of entrenched vacancy in many communities is unjust and racist land use policies. So policies like redlining, racial exclusion from federal home loan programs, exclusionary zoning, they all contribute to a legacy of vacant properties that are still facing communities today. So when communities are denied access to financial resources that are critical to make home repairs, especially of older housing stocks, deferred maintenance is inevitable. And then oftentimes the solution becomes demolition when there's no ability to really make those critical repairs to a home. And then denial of access to financial services, whether it be credit, lending, it's most prominently been felt and experienced based on communities' racial makeup. So today we see the harms imposed by vacant properties having a disproportionate impact on Black residents in majority Black neighborhoods. So one example is, the experience in Louisville, Kentucky. The map on the left, your left too, is a redlining map in the city of Louisville. I know many communities that are on the call have seen this of their own communities and the neighborhoods that have been denied those financial resources. Louisville also has a legacy, racial covenants, and kind of being the city that had brought Supreme Court case that determined that racial covenants were unconstitutional and you couldn't prevent Black residents from living in majority white neighborhoods. But that's had lasting impacts on the housing stock and property stock in the city, with those places where they were denied financial access being the places in the neighborhoods that have the most amount of vacant properties. So the map on your right is not the easiest to read, but the dots show where there's vacant properties or challenging properties that the city is actively going out and maintaining to ensure that they don't cause additional harm. And the city of Louisville has been taking a lot of strides and really innovative work in terms of how they're using their budgeting process to really reflect on how their activities are reaching equitable outcomes. Another example that we have is widespread community removal. Urban renewal projects like those that happened in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that cleared entire neighborhoods of Pittsburgh's Hill District to make way for a hockey arena. And the neighborhoods that were impacted, especially the lower Hill District neighborhoods, still experience the disinvestment that occurred from those urban renewal projects and a legacy of really challenged vacant lots in the neighborhood. On the right side of your screen, we have Montgomery, Alabama, where the interstate highway system was intentionally constructed to break up a flourishing Black community that was home to many civil rights leaders and really kind of the birthplace of the civil rights movements and organization. It was home to the Mount Zion AME Church, where Dr. Martin Luther King really started his civil rights career, kind of really with the intention of causing harm to this particular community and the folks that live there. Another significant trigger and cause for widespread vacancy is population decline. There's many reasons for population movement. Some was related to white flight and kind of the inequitable racial policies that we just talked about. But another major cause is economic shifts. When there's a closure of a major employer or a factory in a community, that's really the heart of that community, or when there's major layoffs in a particular place, folks need to find jobs potentially elsewhere, causing movement of people throughout places. And in many of the cities that community progress has traditionally worked with, has seen really significant population declines. So you have some on your screen of Buffalo and Cleveland and Flint, reaching nearly half of their population, kind of moving elsewhere in the suburbs traditionally or regionally for various reasons. So what happens in a community where the population no longer supports the existing infrastructure that is there? It's a major challenge, and thinking through what we're going to do with those properties and how we're going to set up a community for long-term goals is important and part of our work. And our colleague, esteemed Alan Malik, who I know a lot of folks know, he's been doing a lot of research related to population decline, which has been in the news a lot. Folks are having less children, and that is going to impact communities amongst a whole host of other industries and factors in a way that we kind of don't yet anticipate or know how that's going to look. But just understanding that population is declining in the US and nationally is important for us as we're starting to think through what the trends could be to addressing these vacant properties and where we should dedicate our resources and tools. And at the end of the day, kind of underlying all these challenges is pretty simple economics. It's supply and demand issues. So when there's decades of disinvestment that has happened in a place, there's often a significant amount of repairs that are needed to properties. And oftentimes those repairs exceed the value of that property whenever that repair is completed. And I'm oversimplifying it here. We have, many more resources on kind of the factors leading to this space. But ultimately, if there's a weak market in a particular community, figuring out what to do with those vacant properties requires a lot of coordination, effort, and creative problem solving. It's a kind of a simple issue, but a really complicated way and solution to solve it. So when we're thinking about kind of breaking free of this cycle of vacancy, for those that have been connected to community progress for a while, you know that we pretty staunchly advocated for a coordinated approach. There needs to be many partners at the table that bring various sets of critical expertise and skills and data and information, all working together to achieve, ultimate solutions for these properties. That includes data collection, analysis, and management. So understanding the scale of the problem, but also like what is truly the issue that we're trying to address. That gets to like, who are the owners of these properties? Are they code compliant? Are they tax compliant? What's the history behind this particular parcel that we need to understand as we're thinking about solutions? And then how do we connect those tools that we have access to or need access to those particular problems? And some of those tools include code enforcement. Recognizing that code enforcement is critical to preventing vacancy. So how do we ensure folks are getting the resources that they need to address those deferred maintenance issues so that they don't become vacant? But when and if they do, what are the the legal tools that we could use through code enforcement to really compel compliance and or compel the transfer of those properties. Similarly, delinquent tax enforcement is one of local government's strongest lever points to compel the transfer of vacant and abandoned properties, those ones that are causing extreme harm, to new responsible owners in the quickest way possible to reduce that time that it deteriorates and the time it's causing harm. And then lastly, one of those responsible parties could be a land bank or some type of public ownership of that property to ensure it's being held in a responsible manner and that its ultimate reuse is aligned with community goals. So we're going to take a step back through memory lane, talk about where we've been in the field over the past 10 to 15 years and where we expect things to be going. So this next section, again, is really going to focus on the past 10 to 15 years or so, but it's important to acknowledge the pioneers have laid the foundation for this work that we're all able to practice on. And one of those pioneers is Dorothy Mae Richardson. She's an incredible leader who's widely known as creating the field of community development that we all know today. Her work was started in Pittsburgh and focused on advocating for better housing conditions, addressing the vacancy that she and her neighbors were experiencing, ensuring that the neighborhood was safe and was receiving the critical investment that was deserving of their community. Her foundational work ultimately led to the creation of NeighborWorks America. There's many affiliates across the country who do incredible on-the-ground community development and community advocacy work. So starting in the 1970s, we also saw the original land banks start to form to address those legacy vacant properties that were significant across their communities. And many of the cities that you see listed on your screen had experienced some of those major triggers that we talked about earlier, whether it be economic shifts, population decline, inequitable policies that had led to some amount of entrenched vacancy. We next saw the second generation of land banks coming about in the 2000s in Ohio and in Michigan. They're the real pioneers in the field of connecting land banks to the tax foreclosure system, thinking about what opportunities there might be for reoccurring funding and support for land banks, specifically in Ohio. And these land banks and their leaders really set the framework for how the land bank movement could go and how it's flourished that we see now today. So then we had the housing bubble burst, right? And the foreclosure crisis that hit. There was a significant amount of foreclosures that was happening in 2009 and 2010. And communities that were already dealing with widespread entrenched vacancy got this kind of new load of vacant properties that they had to deal with. Communities that never had vacancy challenges in the past and didn't necessarily have the capacity to deal with them, all of a sudden were getting new vacant properties that they were left to figure out how to solve. At this time, too, we saw the next generation of land banks start to form in New York and Georgia and Nebraska, and state enabling legislation being passed. This is where I got my feet wet in this work, thinking about the land bank legislation for my capstone in grad school, going out in a borough, East McKeesport Borough, who I still love fondly, with a clipboard, rating properties as vacant and their condition from A to E, and really thinking about how we were going to solve the challenges through a land bank and through other community efforts. Following the mortgage foreclosure, there was an unprecedented national campaign focused on demolition. And this was made possible due to the national settlement that came from the mortgage companies to address the abuse of the mortgage industry that led to the housing market collapse. So there was over $25 billion put into these settlement funds, most of which was to forgive debt, but a sizable portion was given to states to address community instability, and it was often used for demolition. So in Ohio, just for example, the Attorney General gave $75 million for demolition of abandoned properties and blighted structures. I should also add that there was the hardest hit funds that occurred in 2016, again distributed to help those communities that were hardest hit by the foreclosure crisis. And these demolitions weren't necessarily happening on the properties that had recently been foreclosed upon, because those were recently occupied in most cases and in okay condition. These property, this funding was really being dedicated to that legacy vacant properties that had been harming communities for over a decade. So it was critically important and helpful to those communities that didn't have those resources in the past. The funding also helped to build the capacity to address vacant properties. In New York, they passed a law holding lenders accountable and requiring that they notify communities when a foreclosure action was happening. And they also had the Zombie and Vacant Properties Grant Program, which gave municipalities additional resources to hire folks to actually track mortgage foreclosure, but also vacant properties and figure out in a strategic way of how they were going to address them. So, just want to note that the demolition activity that was occurring was hugely helpful and important, and it was the dominant strategy to address these legacy vacant properties. But what it also did is when demolition occurs, vacant lots occur right after that. And so many communities are still figuring out what to do with the large inventory of vacant lots. In some places, if they're scattered site and there's been some type of market rebound, they've been able to use those lots to do some infill development in a really helpful way. But in other communities, that's kind of the vacancy is widespread. They remain a challenge, a huge drain on municipal resources for maintaining those properties and mowing them. Kind of very few places actually have a widespread vacant land stewardship strategy, which is something that we certainly encourage. All right, back to the exciting stuff. So again, this is really the time when the field comes into focus, where there is new innovation that is occurring across communities. So the data systems that have come out in this time period were just so incredible. So you don't have to have a grad student with a clipboard writing things from A to E. There's actually new, really accessible tools that can visualize where the challenges are in an accessible way. It allowed communities to really be strategic in how they were thinking about targeting limited resources and to be able to share that story more broadly with the public through maps and data. This was also a time where upstream solutions were beginning to emerge and thinking about how code enforcement can really be focused on compliance and as a way to prevent vacancy in the next demolition candidate from happening. We also saw a strengthening and maturity of the state land bank network. So the land bank enabling legislation had passed. There was a number of land banks coming on board, a lot of peer exchange of information and best practices. These state associations were incredibly effective and are still to this day of advocating for funding to ensure their impacts can be carried on into the future outside of the settlement funding that's no longer available. There's a lot of convenings and folks getting together and learning from each other, both at kind of RVP, which we joke is like a family reunion, but also organic peer exchange of similar sized cities and situations wanting to learn from each other and see each other's challenges. It's also a time where the delinquent tax enforcement process was really honed in on a strategy to effectively deal with vacant and abandoned properties. So, kind of an acknowledgement that it was a really powerful lever points for local governments and thinking through how it could be used in the best way possible. So, as an example, the city of Rochester during this time assessed whether or not tax lien sales were the most appropriate tool, and they actually decided not to use tax lien sales and instead pursue judicial interim foreclosure process to connect that tax foreclosure process to their land banking activities. So again, some folks, maybe even part of this conversation that are on this screen, of course, Congressman Dan Kildee, who's one of the founders of Community Progress, along with Frank Alexander, and a lot of just great innovative minds in the group forming this field. So then 2020 hit, and there was the pandemic. I joke, nobody saw it coming, and we didn't know what to expect. But we know that it changed life as we know it, but also really impacted our communities and the way the community development field is able to respond to some of the challenges. So we saw massive market appreciations across all different property types, single family homes, rental properties. We saw supply chains disrupted. We saw construction costs skyrocketed, making that kind of appraisal gap that much more significant when we're working in weaker market communities. We saw population shifts. So folks working remotely could all of a sudden live wherever they want. They don't necessarily have to live close to their employer. They might not be going into an office space anymore. We saw tax sales actually happening online and new bidders and investors kind of getting involved in a system where they didn't necessarily have to show up at the county courthouse steps anymore. And the narrative really has shifted over the past 5 years around the heating real estate markets and the lack of affordable and quality affordable housing that exists. And that's a hugely important issue to many of us who deeply care about the right to safe and affordable housing. But what it did is it took public attention away to the vacant property challenges that still exist and persist in communities. And it turned local government's attention away from funding to address those challenges and towards, that funding is going towards other things that are dominating the news cycle. We think that there's an interesting and important connection between the two that we'll talk about a little later. But the reality is the market is not rebounding equally across jurisdictions. So examples on your screen, again, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, huge market increase in boom. Prices are going up to wazoo. Gentrification is happening in neighborhoods, but there's still deep vacancy that exists. And what's highlighted on your screen is the Hill District that experienced that urban renewal years ago, decades ago. And the city of Rochester, again, like housing prices soaring beyond what folks could have imagined. But there's still a large inventory of publicly owned and privately owned vacant land and structures that haven't quite felt that rebound yet. And just going back, again, related to Alan Malik's the work that he's been doing and kind of projecting where the challenges of vacancy is going to exist. It really is in the kind of lower resource, lower income neighborhoods that are experiencing entrenched vacancy are likely going to continue that experience of entrenched vacancy, whereas scattered sites in neighborhoods that are rebounding might be absorbed by the market. We also know that entrenched vacancy remains a critical issue in many rural and southern communities. The city of Jackson, which we're doing some work in, is the fastest shrinking city with a population of 50,000 or more. A little teaser, our next session will be on some data collection and analysis efforts that some grassroots leaders are doing in the city of Jackson to really understand that challenge, and we've been working with them through our Code Enforcement Scholarship Program. Also, the picture on your right is of Arkansas. A significant number of counties have vacancy rates of over 12%, many over 20%. So real entrenched challenges. Some of these southern states have policies that limit abilities to address these vacancy challenges. And community progress is taking some intentional, deeper efforts to work with communities in these southern states to really help think through how policy can be reformed and practice can be reformed in the environment that they're dealing with. And it's likely that these smaller towns will continue to experience that vacancy challenge where it will likely get worse, where hyper vacancy will continue on. Also, climate change is happening. It's impacting communities in various ways. It's likely that the intensity of natural disasters will increase. Flooding, hurricanes are happening as we know it. It's going to lead to both short-term and long-term vacancies. And so thinking about how communities can work on that preventative side, but also have the tools in place so that if a climate-related incident occurs, there is the capacity to address that challenge at the quickest rate possible. Brownfields continue to remain stuck in many places. A lot of communities are reluctant to put up brownfields for sale or to move towards foreclosure because of the potential risk that comes along with contaminated sites. Some hot markets that are looking for land to produce more housing are being more aggressive at addressing brownfields. And I think colleague Tark's going to talk about that a little later. And then commercial vacancy, huge problem. And just the way that we interact with commerce has changed so significantly over the past 10 years. So we're not just talking like population decline and folks moving away from some of the communities that had more intact Main Street, but just the way we shop, being more in an online environment, really is imperative that we think about what we do with commercial properties moving forward. I know a lot of cities are also reeling with large urban office spaces that are vacant due to the remote work environment, and how can those be leveraged to meet community needs? And lastly, what's been brought much more into focus is kind of the increase of substandard occupied properties, both homeowner and rental properties. It's becoming a major, a more significant concern for code enforcement. It's always been a concern, but it's been growing over the years. Um, there has been more deferred maintenance, and it's taking up more code enforcement time and energy to figure out how best to solve these issues. Over the past 5 years, there's also been an uptick of tenant rights groups, especially around conditions of properties as the market has increased and as rates have increased, and some more interest in proactive rental licensing and inspection programs and figuring out a way to connect kind of the substandard occupied properties to prevent vacancy moving forward. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tarek.
Thank you, Liz. Can folks hear and see me? Julie, yes? Okay, great.
Yes.
We had the great pleasure of packing a semester-long curriculum into a 45-minute webinar. So thanks for everybody for joining us. But we also want to say that this kind of sets the stage for the year series of webinars, and we'll touch on those at the end and queue up the next couple ones. So the important thing is that the rules are changing, particularly in these last 5 years, and we're definitely are seeing some changes in vacancy that Liz had talked about. So, how do we actually shift our responses, and what are some of the examples in the field in which we're seeing success? Well, the first most important thing is everybody's in this space; they know fund, right? How do I get resources and dollars to address these challenges? And incredibly, and I've been in this space for 20 years, whether it's been states or at the national level, it seems like every second or third year, there's an unprecedented infusion of resources to help. I don't know if we're going to continue that trend for the next few years. We've definitely seen the ARPA dollars have a massive positive impact on communities, but those had to be allocated by the end of 24, and they have to be spent by the end of this year. And there does not seem to be anything in the pipeline that will be filling that void. That is going to have to come from a lot of creativity, but also the states and local municipalities as they can. Some states are going to step in and some have. Others don't have the resources or don't have the political commitment to the same values and goals that we all share. I will say a couple examples in Ohio. They over the last 4 years or 5 years since 2021, they've allocated $900 million towards brownfield remediation. What was incredible was that all of those funds were passed down to county land banks because had built a reputation of excellence, and they were a trusted intermediary to start to address some of these challenges. That is a trend we're starting to see with a lot more land banks moving into that space. But I mean, Ohio has set the standard and also a great model for us to look at replicating to increase the scope and scale of that. As we know, philanthropy still plays an important role in this work, and oftentimes what we have to do is connect the concerns and the problems of vacant properties with some of their pillars and core areas. It's not hard. It is not artificial. It is not forced. It is real. There are real connections between dealing with vacant properties and generational wealth building and closing the racial wealth gap. There's real connections between vacant properties and transforming them and achieving health equity, making a community more equitable, more inclusive, more resilient, improving and promoting housing security, and minimizing involuntary displacement. So all of these goals can be connected, and we're seeing land banks do a better job in articulating those connections to unlock some funds. And then finally is continue to document the harms of vacant properties. We know that they are going to become more and more concentrated in geographical areas. So even in some cities, it's just going to be isolated to a particular neighborhood. Don't overlook the harms that that's causing to those residents in that neighborhood, and continue to document that, make the case for needed investments. A couple examples of, as we talked about, some allocation changes, resource and some policy changes, opening up new partner or cementing new partnerships unlocks new revenue sources. So in New York, the Finger Lakes Regional Land Bank, it realized that there was an opportunity to use some of their assets, some of the vacant properties that had fallen into their portfolio, to support and address the homelessness crisis. They had opened up conversation with a continuum of care members, right? Continuum of care, they exist in all regions and all communities. Not enough land banks or communities are in conversations with those folks because they actually were able to unlock a whole new portfolio of state funding to bring to the rehab of vacant properties and have now added 5 permanent affordable supportive housing, permanent supportive housing to the landscape. In a rural county with a very small population, 5 units is actually significant and will save the county a lot of money in providing emergency housing at hotels. Another example is the Newark Land Bank in Newark, New Jersey, partnering with their housing authority. Housing authorities all across this country have the opportunity to enter into programs where they allow their tenant who holds the voucher to actually use that voucher towards paying off monthly mortgage payments. So the land bank went ahead and rehabbed vacant properties. They worked with a lot of intermediaries as counselors and credit counselors, lending institutions, and moving the tenants through that pipeline and get credit readiness, and actually transform them into homeowners. An incredible program that has a lot of potential. We are launching a learning cohort around this. We just closed the deadline on submissions, but there are almost 30 communities that applied. We're really excited about seeing this model replicated elsewhere. Now, I have to start with the most consequential legal system in the space of the last 30 years, and that's the delinquent property tax enforcement system. As Liz had mentioned, some of those pioneers and our co-founders, Dan Kildee and Frank Alexander, had formed together to do and lead a lot of that work in Michigan. And what they realized is that in order to create effective land banks as a new tool with special powers, it had to be intimately engineered and designed with the delinquent property tax system. So they had to completely reform their tax foreclosure system so it could actually deliver efficiently and effectively and cost effectively those vacant properties that were just discarded by the market and harming neighborhoods. Move those into the land bank. And that model, it sounds so simple, but it's that really model that has been replicated in so many different communities. It's linking a land bank at the back end of the tax foreclosure process for predictable, cost-effective access to ensure that those properties that are causing harm aren't picked up by speculators or some of the worst slumlords in the community, but actually picked up by a public steward that is committed to transforming those properties into equitable outcomes and reuses that support the community goals. And then we had a big supreme shift with this. In May 2023, the Supreme Court took up a case on property tax foreclosure and basically blew up that elegant design. I am being a bit dramatic, but as somebody who experienced the benefits of that when I was a practitioner here in New York, it really was a dramatic shift. It was the right decision from the Supreme Court. The tax foreclosure system had too long for decades harmed and extracted wealth and equity, particularly from Black homeowners in Black neighborhoods. So it was the right decision from an equity decision. But that also then kind of dismantled this really clean connection between land banks and tax foreclosure systems that was critical to allow communities to address vacant and harmful properties. So about 12 states had to change their systems. Most of those places where land banks are prolific were the most impacted. We've definitely even seen some communities that are still nervous about this. There are a number of class action lawsuits in most of these states. Some of them states have already carved out $100 million, $200 million to pay back homeowners for taking their property and surplus wealth through that foreclosure process. So communities, some are still nervous about moving properties through the tax foreclosure systems. Now, how can communities respond? Most of them, the states have reformed their process to be consistent with Tyler. One state, Illinois, is still working on it. We're helping them, but they kind of got to get it out of their own way to be successful. Um, the communities that have made those reforms, what you have to realize now is that tax foreclosure process is critical to improve. One, can you tighten up the bidder rules and criteria to minimize some of those bad actors at the auction? If it's possible, and if the law allows, some municipalities actually take the deed after foreclosure and then auction them off. Well, in that case, you could actually conduct code inspections, create reports so that the bidders are held accountable to the violations that need to be remedied and perhaps maybe in 6 or 12 months. You can also make sure it's key that every public dollar that was invested in these abandoned or vacant properties, right, when the owners externalize the cost under the taxpayer and the community, that every penny spent to minimize those harms are actually part of the minimum bid at the auction. Be financially responsible stewards, or responsible financial stewards, and bring those dollars back in-house if their property is sold. And then finally, move upstream. Let's stop foreclosures in the first place. Let's try to avoid displacement. Let's try to avoid folks losing their homes. And we're seeing many communities that are doing that very effectively. So you can see how the two major changes, both from the heating real estate markets, right, appreciating real estate markets, and the Tyler decision drastically narrowed the pipeline of tax foreclosed vacant properties that are ending up in a land bank's portfolio, or at least ability to end up. So this has made acquisition far more costly for land banks. It hasn't made it prohibitive. It's made it difficult, less predictable, and certainly more costly. So what this means is now like this publicly owned surplus, right? There have been communities where 6 years ago, 1,000 publicly owned properties were seen entirely as liabilities. Now, in the last couple of years, they're starting to see them as assets, right? And what communities need to do to respond is do not engage in fire sales of that portfolio. They are so valuable right now. Make sure that the redevelopment of those properties are consistent with the best outcome for the community. The market doesn't solve our problems, right? The goal wasn't to fix vacancy and return this to the market. The market doesn't create just communities, equitable communities. So when we have the chance to steward those public assets towards more equitable outcomes, we need to take that opportunity. And now, as the markets have heated up and that inventory is narrowed, it is even more critical that they become assets for neighbors and neighborhoods. Communities need to explore some other acquisition strategies too. Tax foreclosure process, as I said, is the primary pipeline for bad properties to be addressed by land banks. Well, code enforcement is another approach, and we're seeing investors sitting on properties, speculators that might be paying their small tax bill, but are doing nothing, maybe accruing a bunch of code violations that are difficult to address because they're registered as an LLC. Well, many states have certain code enforcement tools. Some of them are underutilized. Some are being utilized far more effectively, like in New York in Article 19A. So just explore what those tools are as part of your approach towards addressing vacant properties. And then finally is look at brownfields. As we said, as a market starts to heat up, some of the last parcels that are addressed are brownfields. They're the most costly, the most hazardous, the most risky for private investors. So if land banks or other public entities can move into that, then I think it will present a great opportunity also to address that crisis that seems to be consistent with every community, which is affordable housing. So as you can see here, just to demonstrate, back in like 2016, I would say that in New York, of the 20 plus land banks, 90% of the property that was ending up in the land bank's pipeline came through the tax foreclosure process. Through the National Land Bank Network's annual survey in 2021, you could see that number was 77%. Just last year, it's now 58%. I can guarantee you the next time we do this in 27, that's going to be less than half. So we have to be more creative about how we're approaching some of these challenges. And just to say before we leave this legal consequential system of property tax foreclosure, there may be another shift. The Supreme Court just heard yesterday oral arguments on another case, Pung versus Isabella County. What they're actually asking is the auction a sufficient means by which to or value a property? Or does it need to be listed on the open market or some other strategy? So I will say we've been worried about this, but after listening to the oral arguments yesterday, I'm cautiously optimistic that they're not going to dismantle property tax enforcement system across this entire country and force us into a different process. But stay abreast. We will keep you all informed of the decision when it's rendered in the next few months and what those impacts are. So sign up for our e-newsletter if you haven't done so, so you can be first to hear. And then the last thing I forgot is that moving away from tax foreclosure process connection to the land bank, many states are also just moving to a different enforcement approach entirely, and that's using tax liens. Basically, instead of the jurisdiction holding the debt for multiple years and then retaining the power to foreclose on that property to get the best outcome, they actually sell the debt every year as a tax lien to investors. And then they've also passed that incredible power of foreclosure onto investors. Unregulated market, very predatory. It is not a good approach, but unfortunately, we're starting to see more and more states, particularly in the South, move to this in the last few years. We have a piece online if folks want to read more about it. What is a tax lien sale and why is it harmful? I think I went too fast. Yes. So there is a link there when you get the slide deck. I'd encourage you to check it out if this is new to you. So as Liz talked about, we've been getting far more requests around substandard occupied properties. So it's really looking at code enforcement. How do we now focus on code enforcement, moving it from a traditional punitive enforcement system to one that really is about strategic compliance, helping folks get to compliance instead of punishing them for being in violation. We know what is causing this. Part of this is also just an income. There's just a tremendous income inequality in this country, and so many households living on the edges that is what's causing some of these challenges with deferred maintenance, foreclosures, etc. So how can communities respond? This is a paradigm shift in approach to code enforcement. One, we have to think about investing in home repairs and helping low-income and vulnerable homeowners get to compliance because it's a preventative strategy. If we don't do that in 5 years, we're dealing with a heavily disinvested property that might then require tax dollars to be expended for demolition, right? Investing upstream. Ensuring code enforcement officers have different trainings, that they've built skills like social workers, right? And they can focus on compliance and equity. They understand the history and the dynamics that have created some of these neighborhood conditions. And looking at proactive rental regulation and inspection programs. The most effective policy tool there is, barring none, in ensuring that you're trying to ensure that every rental unit in your community is safe and healthy. And then we have another approach in dealing with vacant properties. I'm running out of time, so I will say here are two resources that we've developed in the last couple years. Our national publication on how we see code enforcement needs to be reimagined, but also a training curriculum that's consistent with this more strategic approach that we developed in partnership with our friends in Cleveland and then retooled for a national resource. So what's next? Should be the question and answers, but two more frames. So as we talked about the shifting markets, the changing legal frameworks, these complex challenges, really, we have to adapt, but we can't lose our values. We have to continue to seek equity, efficiency, and effectiveness in our approach. And as Liz said in the beginning, all starts foundationally with data. And that is an introduction to the next two webinars. We will be looking at an incredible project in Jackson, Mississippi, working with community-based organization. And they did 7,000 surveys of their neighborhood in the last few months, at the last part of last year. So we'll be showing you how they did it, the lessons learned, and now how this is going to help inform some of their code enforcement strategies and conversations with the city about how to address it. And then the second one will be understanding neighborhood housing markets. So really, we see the parcel conditions survey. What are the market conditions that are important in driving and thinking through our interventions? We'll be joined by our partners in Kalamazoo, at the Kalamazoo Land Bank, which we recently completed that work for them as part of their 5-year strategic plan. So with that, I think that's it. And we can address any questions that folks might have had. Liz, I think you were taking a peek in the chat
Yep,
or question and
I
answer.
did. There's a few questions in the question and answer box. That's the best place to put them because it's easier for us to see. There was a question about whether Pennsylvania had passed similar legislation that I referenced in New York, which was requiring lenders to notify communities of mortgage foreclosure actions. And David, not to my knowledge, have they? Somebody from Pennsylvania can certainly chime in and correct me. One way communities have tried to address it where that state legislation didn't exist is through vacant property registration ordinances. And those entities that are most likely to comply have been the mortgage companies versus kind of the totally negligent independent property owners. But not to my knowledge, does Pennsylvania have that in place? Let's see here. Another question. What programs are communities implementing to avoid property tax foreclosure?
Yeah,
Talk.
so I mean, Michigan is a great example that have put together some incredible preventative measures, starting in Detroit, and then statewide, their poverty exemption. Basically, if we want to reduce foreclosure, we have to work way upstream and limit the tax liability for the lowest income and most vulnerable homeowners. And that's exactly what that does. If you qualify so very low income, you have zero taxes. And there are other measures in which they call them circuit tax breakers. There are deferral programs. There are other exemptions that folks can play. I think everybody knows is familiar with either, senior exemptions for homeowners, veteran exemptions, sometimes disability exemptions. So it's just really looking at expanding those programs that reduce the tax liability in the first place. And then when somebody again does get into a little bit of delinquency, is can you provide counseling? Can you provide payment programs, defer some of that to the following year. If you check out our tax enforcement publication that is on our website, it is chock full of programs that exist all along the spectrum of tax enforcement foreclosure.
There was a question. My state passed state enabling legislation to allow for land banks, but only two have been created. What would our suggestion be? Heather, I'm not sure if you're coming from New Jersey, because that's one place that I
But
know
I
the
was going to guess.
legislation exists and there's only two land banks. But I would say, like, generally, the first and best place to start is to really get an understanding of that inventory and of vacant properties to even determine if a land bank is the right tool to address it. If those vacant properties exist that are tax delinquent and you have a tax lien sale process that Tarek talked about, it's hard for land banks to intervene in that situation if all of those tax liens are being sold at market to private investors. Whereas if there's an opportunity where those are not going for sale and they're defaulting to the municipality, or there's an in-rem foreclosure process where the land bank can get involved, that may have greater impact. So I'd say first, just understanding the inventory. Number two is connecting with those other two land banks to exist to determine what led them ultimately to create one and kind of the advocacy that went around that. And then third, we'd be happy to talk with you too to help think through what those strategies and opportunities might be for a land bank in your state. All right. So, question related coming from Pennsylvania community, just about the challenges of more and more LLCs buying up vacant residential and commercial properties over the decade, and code enforcement having limited effectiveness in trying to address those properties and any solutions for them. So, Tarek touched on it very briefly, but we first of all, the influx of investors purchasing properties and hiding behind shell LLCs and creating different LLCs for every single property that they own is a rampant problem across the country. And especially those entities that are holding on to those properties, leaving them vacant, having minimal, if any, investments to really bring them up to code. So when they are vacant, as your comment is suggesting, the best process that we suggest is a fix it up, pay it up, give it up process, whereby the code enforcement goes out, sends notice of violation citations to try to compel that property owner to address the issue. If they don't do it, then there's some type of abatement activity that code enforcement and the city does to bring that property into compliance. And then if that bill is not paid, that there is some enforcement mechanism to either try to collect on that debt that's owed or to compel the transfer of that property to give it up to a new responsible owner through tax sale or through a code lien foreclosure. So that's the most effective and systematic way to deal with those long held or shortly held properties by LLCs that are vacant and continuing to cause harm. But it requires coordination between those entities and departments to really work through that. Anything else you want to add, Tarek?
No, and I think we're coming up on time. Julia usually stops us with 2 minutes to go. Is that right?
Yeah, see.
The
So,
only thing,
yeah.
a parting thought is that even as vacancy decreases, we are nowhere near towards achieving housing justice. Because in so many of the communities in which we're seeing these hot markets, we have record levels of homelessness, increasing housing insecurity, displacement, right? Outside investors and crowding out community control and ownership. So there's a lot of work we need to do. And let's make sure that we retain and hold on to our joy and hope in our allies in this space.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for such a great webinar, for such a great setup to the webinar series for the year. Like Tarek said, we have two really amazing webinars coming up in March and April on parcel and market data. You can get registration links in our resources tab, and those will also be in our follow-up email with the slides and the video recording and ways to contact our speakers and all the other resources in there. So be on the lookout for that email in the next week. I dropped a link to a survey, and if you could just fill that out about your experience, that would help us improve webinars in the future. I think that's it. Have a good afternoon, everyone.